Welcome to In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin. Rabbi Adam Chalom is my guest today. He is a leading voice in the movement of humanistic Judaism. He has served as the rabbi of Kol Hadash Humanistic Congregation in Deerfield, Illinois since 2004. He received his rabbinic ordination from, and he's now the North American Dean of, the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism. That's the leadership and rabbinical training institution of the worldwide movement of secular humanistic Judaism, which we're going to talk about today. Rabbi Chalom also serves on the executive committee of the Association of Humanistic Rabbis, and he's on the editorial board of a quarterly magazine, Humanistic Judaism. He has a PhD from the University of Michigan, Go Blue, in Near Eastern Studies. He is co-editor, along with Jody Kornfeld, of the book we are going to take a deep dive into today. It's called Contemporary Humanistic Judaism, Beliefs, Values, Practices. It is an anthology of the movement's most important texts, published for the very first time. The book was released in January 2025. I'm lucky to have read this the second time because you gave me an early copy. It is truly an important addition to the canon. Welcome, Adam Chalom.
Thank you, Abby. It's wonderful to see you in person, but also to talk about something very close to my heart.
Yes, and we've been friends and kind of internet colleagues or email colleagues, but we've never met in person. I will say that humanistic Judaism is not necessarily in the vernacular of every Jew I know, so I think we have to back up a few paces and define it. Let's start there.
Sure. Humanistic Judaism is a cultural Jewish identity that's celebrated and lived through a human-focused approach to life. So we focus on what people can know and do in the world, on the importance of human knowledge and responsibility for each other, and on the freedom people have to make up their own minds about how they live their life and how they express their identities. For us, Judaism is the inherited culture and creativity of the Jewish people. It includes holidays and life cycle events and rituals and texts, but it also includes music and food and languages and history and archaeology and all the expressions of Jewish life and Jewish identity over all the centuries by all the Jews in all the corners of the world. It's a very wide and varied canon, if you want to use that term, for defining Jewish identity. But most importantly, we start from the premise that it was made by the Jewish people. And if it was made by the Jewish people, then the Jewish people can choose from that library of options and can also adapt it and create their own culture in the modern world to be able to express their Jewishness in a way that's meaningful to them.
So what was missing from that very beautiful, succinct explanation was the word God. Mm-hmm. So where does God fit into humanistic Judaism?
Well, God is certainly a character in the early literature and the medieval and modern literature of the Jewish people, just like there are other gods that are characters in other people's literature. But in terms of a personal entity that intervenes in the world, that cares what you eat or what you wear or whom you love, humanistic Judaism doesn't emphasize that. Instead, we focus on what people can know and can do. One of the old Jewish traditions that we don't continue is trying to save the word God by redefining it. So over the centuries, people have tried to take an older concept and say this new concept is the same as the old concept. So the Hebrew God, the Tetragrammaton, the four-letter name for that God, began as a Canaanite God. It's part of the Canaanite pantheon. But then it became claimed that this was the only God that ever existed, even though it still has one name and one people that it has a preferred relationship with. Then in later generations, Maimonides has his version of a God that is attempting to find consistency with Aristotelian philosophy. Jewish mystics have their own version of the emanations of God through Kabbalah and that literature. In the pre-modern period, you have Spinoza trying to redefine God. You have the early Reform movement redefining God, and the modern Reform movement redefining what the early Reform movement meant by God. You have partnership theology and process theology, and all these attempts to try to save that word. Where humanistic Judaism made a different step was to say, if we want to say love, why can't we praise love? If we want to talk about the power for doing good in the world, why can't we say that? Why do we have to call it God for it to be meaningful? After all, a lot of the traditional prayers are talking about a personal God who's a you, atah male, who's a melech, who's a king, even if you want to translate it as sovereign, as some prayer books do today, to soften the gendering and the authority, This is the character as it was developed. And so in some ways we are willing to take that next step beyond where Reconstructionist Judaism started to redefine things to be more consistent with a more secularized approach to life, and to take that next step and to say we can even change that liturgy, those texts, and in some ways give that phrase of God its traditional meaning and not have to make it mean what we want it to mean. Today, we can say in new words what we want to express and make meaning out of that.
You write, saving the word God by redefining it is both evasive and immoral. Can you explain?
Well, I'm guessing that sounds more like Sherwin Weiner, founding thinker.
Sherwin Weiner.
Yes,
I'm sorry.
and that was certainly one of the founding thinkers, right? And that is certainly his style. A little bit condescending and patronizing. If you knew him, that was exactly how he approached those. And he came out of the Reform movement himself. He was ordained at HUC, worked as a Reform rabbi for many years. So he was part of that breakaway generation. Yes, but he said that the attempt to try to save it is dodging the question of what do you really mean by this? And he said that words had their own meaning. And if the word God had a historic meaning, then tweaking it and twisting it and doing what he called mental gymnastics to the point that it didn't bear any resemblance to what was there before, he just felt wasn't honest in the sense of how you approach language. You should try to say what you mean as best you can and try to mean what you're saying as best you can.
So just so I understand, you're basically, what his critique is, and what you were saying maybe in a more diplomatic way, is that there has been kind of a massaging of the word or idea of God to fit our modern ideas of, what is it, someone who's has his or her hands on the controls. I mean, where has the massaging been seen? I guess I'm missing where there has been kind of an effort to turn God into what we need.
Well, I mentioned the example of translating melech as king into sovereign, which you'll see in a lot of modern prayer books. You'll find alternative language phrasing for blessing formulas. I have an essay in the anthology, actually, that I wrote some years ago called Our Quarterback, Our King, which is drawing on the use of the imagery of God in tradition compared to modern theology. In tradition, God is like the quarterback. He calls all the plays, he makes things happen with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, he has a chosen team that he roots for. But in modern theology, God is a lot more like the coach, who sets the play, but it's up to people to act. Or he's almost like the offensive coordinator who designed the plays a long time ago but doesn't intervene. Or maybe he's like, in Harold Kushner's phrasing, he's like the cheerleader where he encourages you, he wants you to do better, but he can't intervene on the field. The dilemma is, so much of the liturgy, so much of the stories in Tanakh are about a God who intervenes on the field, a God who's the quarterback, who does things. So why are you talking to the coach like they're the quarterback? If you have a different concept of God, you can rewrite your liturgy to have it say what you want it to say. But to keep the old liturgy and then say in the translation or the footnote, so when I say this, I mean that, it just feels like it's a linguistic game to try to preserve the old when you can get more meaning out of adapting. So
does orthodoxy not change the language at all? Or do you see that even?
I'm not a scholar of Orthodox liturgy for that matter, but they've made their own choices even out of the traditional canon. So for example, the famous 13 attributes of God that are part of liturgy and so on, if you read the actual verse in Tanakh, it goes on with a lot of things we might call negative characteristics, but they cut the verse in the middle to focus on the positive. So people are making these choices all the time. So much of the traditional Siddur is cutting and pasting from Psalms and from other passages. It's a collage. And so we make our own choices or adapt things. I'll give you one example. So traditionally, a lot of congregations sing Oseh Shalom from the end of the Kaddish, very famous. He will make peace, Bimromav in his heights, Aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, for us and for all Israel. What we've done is we've adapted that text. So we sing instead, Na'aseh Shalom, we will make peace, Aleinu v'al kol ha'olam, for us and for all the world. And we make peace ba'olam, in the world, in this world that we know. So we can sing the same melody, we can clap at the same point in the song, but we can use words that we really believe deeply and still feel some continuity with the past while also having the integrity of singing and saying words that we really believe.
So for those who listen to this and say, how is it still Judaism without God? How is it a religion without the divine? I know that's a fundamental question, but I'm sitting here with a rabbi whom I know because we've had a lot of exchanges. You are learned. You understand the texts. You're not just kind of flying by the seat of your pants. So it's a little bit hard to square, again, that it is entirely kind of secularly oriented and still a religion.
So let me look at it from two sides. One is we understand Jewish religion as under the umbrella of Jewish culture. That is, Jewish culture includes holidays, life cycle events, and history and literature, which includes the Tanakh as part of Jewish literature. And many people approach even their religious lives as if it were cultural. For example, you might have a Passover Seder, where you pick and choose which readings you're going to do. You change the menu every year. You're treating it like a cultural inheritance that you get to change instead of a religious fixed item that you have to do exactly the same way. Now, there are Jews that do that, but there are most Jews, or many Jews certainly, who are more flexible in their approach, and they're more expansive in their definition of what counts as Jewish culture. I mean, ironically, Chinese food is Jewish culture one day a year, right? But it is in its own way. And so religion is part of culture. So it's not like there's a hard line one way or the other. The other side of this is that we meet the needs that religion meets. Religion provides a calendar for life. It provides a sense of meaning and purpose. It provides a connection to something beyond yourself. It provides a heritage and a way to celebrate the important moments in the calendar and the natural cycle of life. So we provide a way to meet those needs that religion meets, even if we do so in a different key. I think of it like a transposition into humanism, where it's still meeting those human needs that Jewish culture meets. We might need to sit Shiva after someone dies. We don't necessarily have to do it for 7 days on low stools with all the mirrors covered, but a lot of Jews don't do it for 7 days on low stools with all the mirrors covered. They've adapted that religious element to meet their needs and lifestyles, and that's what we do in the big picture.
And what's a week in a humanist Jew's life, would you say? Like, I mean, it doesn't mean that every one of them is the same, but how much of a Jewish blueprint remains?
Well, it depends on their particular interest. Maybe they're reading a Jewish novel, or they want to listen to Jewish music one particular day. It doesn't necessarily have to be on a scheduled day, that on every Thursday they're going to do this or that. That's part of the human self-empowerment that we provide for them, that they can choose which ways they connect.
That you're connecting Jewishly somehow. I mean, just as a rabbi, if someone comes to you, do you say, I strongly encourage you to have at least some kind of routine, some Jewish routine, or do you not even feel like that?
Well, I mean, we certainly offer regular Shabbat services, mostly Friday evening services. We do have a Sunday school educational program for people that have children and parents also. We might do a weekly adult learning class. We send out a regular email that includes a newsletter and sometimes an article of insight or reflection or links to videos that we've done in the past. So we provide multiple points of contact and opportunity. And like many congregations post-COVID, we have a YouTube channel and we have videos and learning classes. So we provide many ways to connect. Ultimately, it's up to the individual whether their Jewishness is going to be a daily thing or a once-a-week thing, or in many cases, a few times a year thing. It could be when they have a yahrzeit coming up to remember somebody's anniversary of their death. It could be at the high holidays or Passover or Hanukkah. And we provide opportunities for all of those moments in the calendar when it's meaningful for them to connect. But we don't tell them you have to do it this way. I mean, the irony is, in a modern world, certainly for liberal Jews, all we can do is recommend. We can't command.
Right.
So we're on the level of
that's true for non-humanistic Jews.
Exactly.
What about Torah, Tanakh? There's obviously a lot of God language there. How are you teaching or explaining, particularly to young people?
Well, we're not allergic to the character. That is, we can read a story about a God who does things, just like we can read Greek mythology about gods that do things. That's how we read these stories, as stories with God as a character. You know, you can sort of flip it around, that people created God instead of God creating people from a humanistic perspective. What you do find in some liberal synagogues is this concept of the Torah as people plus God, that there's some kind of divine influence that influenced the people that wrote it, even if they wrote it later in a different perspective. Our perspective is that it was just people, from their own insight, their own experience, their exposure to other cultures. And so when we take a Torah out of an ark, we don't say this is the Torah that Moses placed before the children of Israel from the mouth of God by the hand of Moses, which is the traditional blessing. And from our perspective, we find it a little odd that some liberal Jewish congregations would say that when their rabbis in rabbinical school learned that isn't what happened, that it wasn't all given to Moses on Sinai in that same way from a historical perspective. Well, so we want to say something else. Maybe we say this is the Torah the Jewish people created over many centuries. That's how we can keep that tradition, but keep it meaningful and consistent with our approach.
And
we don't do, just to finish, we don't do a Torah study every week necessarily, and we don't require that our bar or bat mitzvah or b mitzvah students are assigned the Torah portion for that particular week. They're allowed to choose. If they want to do a Torah reading, they could choose a Tanakh reading or some other source, or choose a topic or an issue that's interesting to them. But if they do a Torah reading, they're shown what the Torah portion would be for that week. But if it doesn't resonate with them, they can choose another portion that's relevant to them. We're not tied to that traditional cycle, but this is part of our literature. And the last thing to say about Torah and Tanakh is that our sense of the canon of what counts as Jewish literature is broader than just the Torah. So we have to make an ark with like bookshelves to have other books next to the Torah scroll, or in one congregation we have the Torah scroll in the library with the other books. It's an important book, it's an ancient Jewish book, you can't check it out from the library, it's on extreme reserve, but it's the beginning of Jewish literature, not the end of Jewish literature.
Are you closing off the possibility of God? If you have a young person who's kind of coming up in your synagogue, will they have kind of been taught God out of the possibility?
They're taught a Judaism that can be meaningful without an active divine personality presence in their Jewish expression, but we like the value that they get to make up their own mind. And sometimes they make up their own mind that they don't agree with our dominant approach, and that's fine. They've learned the lesson. The lesson was make up your own mind. And it would be kind of an odd circumstance where I tell people to make up their own mind, but you have to agree with me all the time. I find that if I were in a congregation where people agreed with me 100% of the time, I would be nervous, because that's called a cult. That's not a setting where people are thinking for themselves.
So often I hear rabbis explain God by talking about the things you can't explain. Mm-hmm. Whether it's watching a baby be born, whether it's watching someone die in front of you, whether it's watching an act of friendship that feels beyond kind of the practical or just reality. How do you have language for those moments? And can I ask, do you yourself feel some sense of the divine?
Well, I wouldn't call it divine because of all of the baggage that's attached to that particular word. We certainly have a concept of inspiration, a sense of feeling part of something larger than yourself. That's a human emotional experience. The question is, what meaning do you put onto that feeling? It doesn't have to be coming from above and beyond to be deeply meaningful. People sometimes think that a humanistic Jew doesn't have any spirituality. And if it means talking to the spirit world, then generally no. But if it means looking for inspiration, finding uplift, all of those are very meaningful concepts because those are human needs, you know. We can go into nature and feel part of something greater than ourselves. I can find transcendence through human culture, whether it's an ancient menorah or seeing a bar mitzvah take place in a synagogue that was built thousands of years ago, or looking at the hand paintings on the wall of the cave paintings where thousands of years ago someone took their hand and put it on the wall and blew some paint, and you can almost you'd ruin it, but you could put your hand there and say, this is someone saying, I was here. That's electric. And it doesn't have to be supernatural to be resonant. Jewish history is a real source for this. The first time I visited the Western Wall, I went up and touched the stones, and I had to wear a paper yarmulke because that's what they handed out, and I forgot to bring a baseball cap. And I didn't like the gender segregation there, and I knew about the history of that plaza that was only built by destroying buildings in what was called the Fifth Quarter of Jerusalem. So I knew all that history. But when I touched the stones and they were smooth, that's what was meaningful to me. It wasn't that I was closest to the Holy of Holies. It's that generations of my people had touched those stones and made them smooth. And that was transcendence for me. So I have that feeling. I get those experiences. I don't have to put a supernatural label or layer to it.
I want to get to the structure of the book, but before I do, I want to touch on Israel. You were just talking about the Kotel. Mm-hmm. How do you teach about Israel, think about Israel within this paradigm?
Well, we're comparable to other liberal Jewish congregations in that we find a lot of meaning through the history of the land, and our connection to the global Jewish people includes this other largest Jewish community aside from the United States. You can't be connected to Jewish peoplehood and not talk about Israel. And we also value in particular the secular Jewish culture that's developed there over the centuries. Many of the founders were themselves secularized Jews, and their connection was historical and activist and not religious. A lot of the songs in our canon for our repertoire are Israeli songs that again express that sentiment. I mean, even Shir LaShalom, the Song of Peace, says, "Don't whisper a prayer, go out and act for peace." That's a humanistic message.
That was the song that Rabin was singing before he was assassinated.
Exactly. So that is very resonant for us. I mean, some of the issues that Israel deals with in terms of recognizing non-Orthodox Judaism and issues of pluralism, issues of LGBTQ identity and acceptance there, negotiating the balance between a Jewish state and a democratic state. We're grappling with all those issues, and obviously the conflict with the Palestinians and trying to balance Jewish survival with human rights and compassion. Those are all issues that congregations argue over. We do try to maintain the conversation. So we do have an essay in the volume by one of our rabbis in New York about how can we talk about Israel, even if we disagree and come from different perspectives. How do we find a way to continue to talk? Because from our perspective, we don't have to have one unified answer on it, but we have to talk about it. You have to stay in relationship with it. And that's really what we strive for. And when we teach about it in our schools, it's learning the history and learning about some of the controversies. You know, one of the dilemmas that a lot of the young people who are complaining about Israel today have is they feel like they weren't taught what's really happening there. And so we don't want to create that problem. We want to teach what's happening there, and if you can live with that complex identity growing up, then you can live with a complex relationship going forward.
So obviously you've written throughout this book, I think very, very powerfully. Talk about how it's structured. There's different essays from those who have been kind of at the forefront of this thinking. How should someone use it?
Well, the four major chapters in the book are our beliefs, and then we also talk about Jewish identity and how we define that. We talk about expressing Jewish culture and how that is the basis for this identity. And then we, in the fourth section, have some examples of how does the rubber hit the road. The Yiddish phrase is tachlis, like what happens when you're actually doing this. So we wanted to give people really concrete examples of what would an education program look like, how do we handle certain life cycle events, what would liturgy look like, because people who've never been to a humanistic service imagine it's just like a CIA redacted document with a lot of blackout lines for all the places where we don't say this and not that. It's really a shift in focus. So instead of focusing above and beyond, we focused on the here and now, and we focused within ourselves. So we wanted to give some concrete examples in that fourth section of the book. In terms of what someone can do is they can, again, look through the table of contents, see what titles seem interesting to them. Maybe they're more philosophically oriented, and they want to look at the sections talking about spirituality and God and ethics and how we approach those questions. Other people might be more interested in what does it mean to define your Judaism as Jewish culture? How does that express itself? What kind of sources do you draw on? Some of them might be interested in those questions of identity, whether it's approach to Israel or who is a Jew and how would you handle someone who wants to become Jewish from a humanistic perspective. Or they might want to look at those concrete examples to see what does the liturgy look like? How do they approach this question of creating a humanistic Jewish community that can celebrate and commemorate together?
So I think, one half of me is channeling people very close to me who feel incredibly Jewishly connected and don't believe in God. Mm-hmm. I know how many Jews feel that way, and that Judaism doesn't exclude those non-believers. But then the other half of me is thinking about the critics who are listening to this and saying, you're watering down what Judaism is, and we're already having enough trouble keeping people in the tent and in the fold, and now it's kind of like bagel and lox Judaism here, and you're telling someone they can read, Saul Bellow instead of going to synagogue, and that's sufficient.
Well, it might take longer to go to read Saul Bellow than it would to attend a service.
It might be a heavier lift.
Yeah, right. And more sort of personally relevant and grappling, particularly given the language it's in and the kind of psychological issues. I mean, I would like to not choose which is better in terms of doing Jewish. There's lots of things you can do that count as doing Jewish. It could be reading, it could be cooking, and this also dovetails with our experience that some people are good at some things and not good at other things. They're more interested in some things than others.
But this is coming from someone who has studied and been ordained. So you have the full menu. You have access to all of that.
Right.
So
well, my job is to be the tour guide. Tell me what you're interested in, what kind of Jewish experiences speak to you from your past and memories, and let's find more ways to do that. One of my favorite parts of the book is actually the end of the book, because we included a list we called Go Forth and Learn. And the idea was, based on the story of Hillel, where he's told, he's asked the question, do Judaism on one foot? And he says, It's this, and now go forth and learn. We wanted to say this is the beginning, not the end. So we tried to list examples of popular culture, books, articles, academic research, as well as just expressions of the ideas of every section in the book. So if you found something particularly resonant, here's something else you can read. There is a boundless curriculum in humanistic Judaism. It's not just take the Torah and turn it and turn it and turn it, or read all the Talmud and all the Talmud commentaries and all the commentaries on the commentaries. Orthodoxy has its infinite curriculum too, but so do we, in all of those expressions of Jewish identity, history, culture, language, all through the centuries. And the last point to make about watering down is that everybody is choosing what they're including in Jewish life. So it may be that the ultra-Orthodox know a lot more about Talmudic commentary than I do, but maybe they know very little about archaeology. Or they don't know as much about Yehuda Amichai poetry, or the work of a wonderful author named Abigail Pogrebin about Jewish identity.
Now you have me sold.
They're not reading that. They're reading something else. So that's the joy of the Jewish library, is there's lots of categories and lots of sections. And you might go to some and someone else might go to another one, but it doesn't mean that it's thinner. It's just focused differently. And the last thing to say on the bagel and lox thing, people try to denigrate Jewish food as not really important. But when you go to a holiday meal and they don't have the family dish that everyone wants, you're going to hear it. People take it very seriously. Yeah. And so food is not just to be dismissed.
It has bound us for centuries.
And there's also a gender component to that too, where Jewish food was often the domain of Jewish women, and Jewish Talmud study was the domain of Jewish men. And so denigrating one and elevating the other is making a value statement there. Yeah. And for us, it's all Jewish culture, it's all Jewish identity, and it all adds to the richness of the Jewish experience.
Where can someone find you if they want to? Which website where they find?
So our institute is iishj.org.
Okay.
And we've just launched a new site this last month with all kinds of connections to our resources for other books, videos, reading opportunities, as well as our professional training programs for officiants, leaders, and rabbis.
Great.
I'm also in the Chicago suburbs at kolhadash.com, kolhadash.com. And they also have their own YouTube channel if you want to find that. I'm also on the usual socials.
Great. Thank you, Rabbi Adam Chalom, for being here and for this book, Contemporary Humanistic Judaism, Beliefs, Values, and Practices. I'm Abigail Pogrebin for In the Spotlight. I'll see you next time.